There's a version of you that nobody has ever met. Not your partner, not your closest friend, not even the therapist you've been seeing for years. There's a version of you that exists only on the inside, behind the listening, behind the caring, behind the constant scanning of every room you walk into. And that version of you is exhausted in ways you've never been able to explain to anyone. The inner life of an empath doesn't look anything like what people imagine. It's not soft. It's not serene. It's not a gentle hum of feeling that flows through you like warm water. It's a storm system that never fully stops, a series of rooms inside your psyche that most people don't even know exist, and a level of internal processing so relentless that by the time you sit down at the end of the day, you've already lived through more psychological experience than most people encounter in a week. Jung spent much of his career fascinated by people like this, not because they were fragile, though the world often treated them that way, but because their inner architecture was genuinely different from the majority of people he studied. He found that empaths didn't just feel more, they processed reality through a fundamentally different internal structure. Their consciousness operated on multiple tracks simultaneously. Their psyche contained regions that most people never develop, and the gap between what empaths showed the world and what was actually happening inside them was so vast that Jung considered it one of the most misunderstood phenomena in human psychology. Today, I'm going to take you inside the empath's inner life the way Jung understood it. Not the romanticized version, not the spiritual meme version, the real thing, the constant processing, the hidden rooms, the exhaustion no one sees, the profound loneliness of having an interior world so complex that describing it to someone who doesn't share it feels like trying to explain color to someone who's never seen it. And if you are an empath, what I'm about to describe is going to feel like someone finally turned on a light in a room you've been sitting in alone for years. What Jung noticed about empaths was that they were never just doing one thing internally. When an empath sits in a conversation, their conscious mind is tracking the words being said. That's the surface. That's what everyone does. But underneath that surface, their psyche is running at least 2 or 3 additional processes simultaneously, and none of these processes are optional. They can't shut them off any more than you can shut off your hearing. The first layer beneath the words is emotional atmosphere. The empath is registering the emotional state of the person speaking, not what they claim to feel, but what they actually feel. This isn't guesswork. It's a form of perception that operates faster than thought. Before the empath can consciously think, "This person seems tense," their body has already responded to the tension. Their stomach tightens, their breathing shifts, their nervous system has already absorbed the data and is processing it somatically in the body before the mind catches up. The second layer is pattern recognition. While listening, the empath's unconscious is comparing what's being said against what's being felt, against previous interactions, against microsignals in tone and posture and word choice. It's assembling a picture that's far more complete than anything the speaker intends to communicate. The empath isn't trying to do this. It's happening automatically, constantly, with everyone. The third layer is the most exhausting one and the hardest to explain. It's what Jung would have recognized as unconscious resonance. The empath's psyche is not just perceiving the other person's emotional state, but partially mirroring it internally. The empath's inner world is generating a faint copy of what the other person feels, almost like an echo. This is what allows empaths to understand people with such unsettling accuracy. They're not imagining what it would be like to feel that way. They're getting a direct, embodied sample. Now multiply this by every person in the room, every interaction in the day, every phone call, every text message with emotional subtext, every stranger on the bus whose grief is radiating off them like heat from pavement. The empath's inner life is processing all of this, all the time, without pause, without a switch to flip, without anyone on the outside having any idea how much is happening behind the empath's calm, attentive face. This is why empaths are tired. Not because they're weak, because they're running an internal system that would overwhelm most people within hours. This exhaustion is legitimate, not a character flaw, not oversensitivity, not poor boundaries. It was the natural consequence of a psyche doing exponentially more work than it was ever given credit for. The processing is only one room in the empath's inner architecture. There are others, and some of them are rooms the empath themselves barely knows how to enter. Empaths almost universally develop what Jung might have called a divided interior. There's the room they show people, the listening room, the caring room, the room where they hold space and absorb and offer comfort. This room is well lit, well furnished, well practiced. The empath has spent their entire life in this room because this is the room that earned them love. This is the room that made them valuable. This is the room that kept them safe in families where being useful was the only reliable path to belonging. Then there's another room, locked, sometimes boarded shut. This is the room that holds everything the empath actually feels about their own life. Not what they feel about other people's lives. They're experts at that. But their own anger, their own needs, their own desires, their own grief about how much of themselves they've given away. This room exists in every empath Jung studied, and almost none of them had been inside it willingly. The locked room is where the empath's shadow lives. Not the shadow of cruelty or malice. Empaths tend to fear those things so deeply that their shadow takes a different form. The empath's shadow is usually made of rage, selfishness, and the desperate desire to stop caring. It's the part of them that wants to walk out of a conversation without worrying about how the other person feels. The part that wants to say, "I don't care about your problems right now." The part that fantasizes about disappearing, not dying, just vanishing from every relationship and obligation and emotional demand. This shadow wasn't pathology, it was balance. The psyche generates shadow material as a counterweight to whatever the conscious personality over-identifies with. If the empath's entire conscious identity is built around being caring, available, and emotionally attuned, the shadow will naturally contain everything opposite. The desire to be cold, unavailable, emotionally detached. Not because the empath is secretly cruel, because their psyche is trying to survive the imbalance of giving everything away and keeping nothing. Most empaths are terrified of this room. They catch glimpses of it, moments of sudden irritation that seem disproportionate, fantasies about cutting everyone off, periods of emotional flatness where they feel nothing and wonder if something is wrong with them. These aren't malfunctions. They're the locked room leaking, the shadow pressing against the door because it needs to be acknowledged. And here's what Jung would want every empath to understand about that room. It doesn't contain a monster. It contains you, the parts of you that got sacrificed to build the caring, attuned, always available persona that the world rewards. The anger that would have protected you if you'd been allowed to feel it. The selfishness that's actually just healthy self-interest wearing a name you were taught to be ashamed of. The desire to stop caring that's actually a desperate signal that you've been caring for everyone except yourself for so long that your psyche is starting to shut down to survive. The empath's inner life has still more rooms than these two. There's a room Jung spent years trying to understand, the room where the empath holds other people's unprocessed material. This is one of the strangest and most poorly understood aspects of the empath's inner world. It's not enough that empaths perceive and mirror what others feel. They actually retain it, like a sponge that absorbs water and then can't figure out why it's so heavy. The empath walks through their day collecting emotional residue from everyone they encounter, and this residue doesn't just evaporate when the interaction ends. It lingers, it settles. It takes up space in the empath's psyche like furniture that doesn't belong to them, but somehow ended up in their house. Jung recognized this as a form of psychic contamination, not in the mystical sense, but in the psychological sense. The empath's boundaries between self and other are thinner than most people's. What belongs to them and what belongs to someone else gets blurred. They finish a conversation with a depressed friend and spend the next 3 hours feeling depressed without connecting it to the conversation. They leave a family gathering carrying anxiety that isn't theirs and don't realize it until they've been home for hours and the feeling starts to fade for no apparent reason. This room, the room full of other people's unprocessed emotions, is what makes empaths feel crazy, because they're experiencing feelings that don't match their circumstances. They're carrying weight they can't identify. They're exhausted by burdens they didn't consciously pick up. And when they try to explain this to someone who doesn't have this inner architecture, they sound irrational. "I just feel heavy and I don't know why. Something's wrong, but I can't point to anything. I feel like I'm carrying something that isn't mine." They're not being vague. They're being accurate. They just don't have language for what's happening because most psychological frameworks don't account for this kind of internal experience. There's something else happening in the empath's inner life that Jung found particularly significant, and it's the thing that makes empaths feel most alone. It's the room of knowing. Empaths know things they shouldn't know, not in any supernatural sense, in a deeply psychological sense. Their multi-layered processing, their pattern recognition, their emotional perception, their unconscious resonance, all of these combine to produce conclusions that arrive fully formed without any conscious reasoning process. The empath knows a relationship is over before the couple knows a coworker is about to quit before any signs appear, knows someone is lying while everyone else believes them, knows something is wrong with a friend who insists they're fine. This knowing is isolating because it can't be explained. The empath can't point to evidence. They can't construct a logical argument for what they perceive. They just know. And when they try to voice it, they're met with confusion or dismissal. How do you know that? You're reading into things. You're being paranoid. So they learn to keep the knowing silent. They sit in the room of knowing alone, watching things unfold exactly as they perceived they would, never being able to say, "I told you so," because they were never believed when they tried to tell. Jung saw this knowing as a genuine cognitive capacity, the unconscious processing massive amounts of data and delivering conclusions that the conscious mind hasn't caught up with yet. There was nothing mystical about it. It was the natural output of a system designed to perceive more than most systems perceive. But the loneliness it created was real and profound, because having accurate perception that no one validates is a specific kind of isolation that doesn't have a name. If what I'm describing resonates, if you've spent years navigating rooms inside yourself that nobody seems to know about, you might find something valuable in our guide, True Self-Discovery. It's built around 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed not to fix you, but to help you finally map what's actually inside. To enter the rooms you've been avoiding and find out what's been waiting for you there, click below to get True Self-Discovery. Now here's where the empath's inner life gets both more difficult and more hopeful. Because there's one more room that most empaths haven't discovered yet. It's the room that exists behind the locked door, behind the shadow, behind the knowing, behind the accumulated weight of everyone else's emotions. It's the room Jung spent his career trying to help people find. He called it the self. Not the self with a lowercase s, the personality, the ego, the constructed identity. The self with an uppercase S, the organizing center of the entire psyche, the place where all the contradictions resolve, where the caring and the rage and the exhaustion and the knowing and the shadow all come together into something whole. Most empaths never find this room because they're so busy managing the other rooms. They're so consumed with processing everyone else's emotions, suppressing their own shadow, sitting alone with their knowing, carrying weight that isn't theirs, that they never go deep enough to discover that beneath all of this chaos is a center of genuine stillness. Not performed peace, not spiritual bypass calm. Actual stillness that comes from being complete unto yourself. Jung's concept of individuation, becoming the person you actually are beneath all the adaptations and performances and survival strategies, is particularly relevant for empaths, because empaths have built more adaptive layers than almost anyone. Every room in their inner architecture was built for survival. The processing room developed because they needed to read environments accurately as children. The caring room developed because being useful was how they stayed safe. The locked room developed because their real feelings were too dangerous to show. The accumulation room developed because they never learned where they ended and others began. The knowing room developed because perceiving truth was necessary when truth was being denied all around them. Every single room served a purpose. None of them are wrong or broken. But they were all built for survival, not for living. And there's a difference between a psyche organized around surviving and a psyche organized around being whole. The path from survival architecture to wholeness architecture is what Jung called the individuation journey. And for empaths, it involves specific psychological tasks that most self-help frameworks completely miss. The first task is distinguishing between self and other inside the inner world. Not just intellectually understanding that you absorb other people's emotions, but developing the internal capacity to recognize in real time which feelings belong to you and which ones walked in with someone else. This sounds simple. It is devastatingly difficult. Because the empath has spent their entire life with blurred boundaries, that blurring is foundational to how their psyche operates. Learning to perceive the boundary line between mine and theirs requires rewiring patterns that have been running since childhood. Jung would have approached this through active imagination and deep self-observation. Sitting with a feeling, asking it questions. Where did you come from? Do you belong to me? Are you mine to carry? This isn't magical thinking. It's a form of internal dialogue that helps the empath develop discernment within their own inner world. And that discernment, once it develops, changes everything. Because suddenly the empath isn't drowning in an undifferentiated ocean of feeling. They're standing in their own emotional reality, clearly perceiving others' emotions without being consumed by them. The second task is opening the locked room, integrating the shadow. And for empaths, this is particularly terrifying because their shadow contains the very things their identity was built to never be. The empath who has spent 30 years being the caring one must face the part of them that doesn't care. The empath who has always been available must face the part that wants to disappear. The empath who prides themselves on understanding others must face the part that resents being understood by no one. This isn't about becoming selfish or cold. It's about claiming the full spectrum of your humanity. Jung was clear. You don't integrate the shadow by acting it out. You integrate it by acknowledging it, feeling it, allowing it to exist as part of your psychological reality without either suppressing it or being controlled by it. The empath who can acknowledge, "I'm furious and I don't want to help anyone right now," without guilt or shame, has more psychological power than the empath who forces themselves to be caring while resentment builds beneath the surface. The third task is learning to use the knowing room consciously. Instead of sitting in it alone, confused and isolated, the empath learns to trust what they perceive and act on it. Not by announcing their perceptions to everyone, most people aren't ready for what empaths see, but by letting their knowing inform their choices. Trusting the recognition that someone isn't safe, acting on the perception that a situation is heading somewhere bad, believing their own internal data even when no one else validates it. This is what Jung meant when he talked about developing a relationship with the unconscious. The empath's knowing is unconscious processing surfacing as intuition. Learning to trust it, to take it seriously, to act on it even when it can't be rationally justified, is how the empath moves from being overwhelmed by their perception to being empowered by it. The fourth task is the most radical one, and it's the one most empaths resist longest. It's emptying the accumulation room, putting down the emotional weight that doesn't belong to you. And this isn't a one-time event, it's a daily practice, a discipline. Because the empath system is designed to absorb, and it will keep absorbing unless the empath actively and repeatedly chooses to release what isn't theirs. A boundary practice operating at the deepest psychological level. Not boundaries in the sense of telling people what you will and won't tolerate, though that matters too. Boundaries in the sense of your psyche learning to maintain its own territory. Learning that you can perceive someone's pain without holding it for them. That you can understand someone's wound without trying to heal it. That you can see someone clearly without becoming responsible for what you see. This is hard. This goes against everything the empath's survival system was built for. That system was built on the premise that absorbing kept you safe, that carrying others' weight made you valuable, that being empty of yourself and full of everyone else was how you earned love. Putting down the weight feels like abandoning the strategy that kept you alive. And in a way, it is. You're abandoning a survival strategy, because you don't need to survive anymore. You need to live. And here's what Jung found on the other side of these four tasks. A version of the empath that the world has never met. Not because it's a new creation, because it was always there, buried under all the survival architecture, waiting in the deepest room of the inner world. This version still perceives, still feels, still knows. The fundamental wiring doesn't change. The empath doesn't stop being an empath. But the relationship to that wiring transforms completely. Instead of being flooded by perception, they're informed by it. Instead of being consumed by feeling, they're guided by it. Instead of being isolated by knowing, they're protected by it. The empath who has done this inner work doesn't look like what you'd expect. They're not performing compassion constantly. They're not available to everyone. They're not radiating warmth in every direction. They're quieter, more selective. Sometimes they seem almost detached, and people who knew the old version wonder what happened. What happened is they finally entered every room in their inner world, faced what was in each one, and organized their psyche around wholeness instead of survival. They can sit in a room full of emotional chaos and remain centered, not because they've stopped perceiving the chaos, but because they know which feelings are theirs and which aren't. They can see someone's shadow clearly and feel compassion without feeling compelled to rescue. They can know something is true and let it be true without needing anyone to agree. They can feel their own anger, their own needs, their own desires without the crushing guilt that used to accompany any form of self-focus. This is what the empath's inner life looks like when it's no longer organized around everyone else. And getting here isn't a single breakthrough. It isn't a weekend retreat or a meditation practice or a book. It's years of slow, honest, often lonely internal work. Years of entering rooms you've avoided. Years of learning to distinguish your feelings from the world's. Years of putting down weight you've been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't yours. Jung never promised this would be easy. He promised it would be real. And for empaths, people who have spent their entire lives navigating a reality most people don't even know exists, real is the only thing that actually helps. If you've never been able to explain your inner life to anyone, if you felt like you're operating a system nobody gave you a manual for, if you've been exhausted by a process that runs constantly beneath a calm exterior, if you've known things you couldn't prove and felt things that didn't belong to you and carried weight you couldn't name, you're not broken. You're not too sensitive. You're not imagining it. You have an inner world with rooms most people will never know about, and every one of those rooms exists for a reason. The work isn't to demolish them. The work is to enter each one consciously, understand what it holds, decide what stays and what gets released, and eventually find your way to the room at the center, the one that was always there, waiting, quiet, yours. That's the empath's inner life according to Jung. Not a gift, not a curse. A complex, demanding, often overwhelming inner architecture that, when finally understood and consciously inhabited, becomes something extraordinary. Not because it makes you special, because it makes you whole. And wholeness, real wholeness, the kind that holds shadow and light, perception and boundaries, knowing and release, is the only thing that was ever going to make this inner life livable. Jung knew that, and now, maybe, so do you. If you're ready to start mapping what's actually inside, not fixing it, not transcending it, just finally seeing it clearly, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this. 24 reflection exercises grounded in Jung's work, designed to help you find your own way within, not someone else's path, yours. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.